I don't think I ever missed a bar association meeting or a picnic, and it was part of your life as a lawyer.
Yeah.
Well, the meetings were held, surprisingly, in the courtroom. And afterwards, we would go to the lawyer's lounge for refreshments. And we never used courtroom number 1, only because we weren't allowed. But we used all the other courtrooms, especially on courtroom on 3rd floor where the 4 courtrooms were. And the attorneys sat all over, the jury box, wherever they could, because at that particular time we had, in the early 60s, about 260 attorneys, of which maybe half of them would attend the meeting. And we had no executive directors at the time, and the secretary of the Bar Association, which was an elected officer from the general attorneys, would be there, well, as long as he wanted to serve, so to speak. And he was responsible for handling all the correspondence and the minutes and the meetings and setting up all the arrangements. And at the time that I came in '59 and began to attend the meetings, Judge Lipson, at that time was not a judge, but he was the secretary. And he went on until about 1963, and then Bill Boswell took over, and Bill Boswell went on till '67, and then I took over, and I went on to '74. And during that particular time, generally, the officers that were the secretaries for any length of time would then move up to second vice president, president-elect, and then president. And that's how the officers would go. The difficulty that we had was that a lot of the members were coming back from World War II at that particular time, finishing school and coming into the bar, so you had a much older group of young attorneys, so to speak. And the young attorney at that time was called the Junior Bar Association of Dauphin County, and it kind of dissipated during the war. There were no young lawyers, and so afterwards it began to get organized, and I think it started again in about 1961 or 62, because I remember meeting in the lawyer's lounge after work and trying to organize the Junior Bar Association. And we activated it again, and of course it's now a rather large organization within our bar.
You know, Len, one thing that I remember on the number, we're unique, Dauphin County, because all the state lawyers who were employed by the state, there were many of them that wanted to join the Dauphin County Bar. Now, they didn't practice actively, but they would participate.
Oh, sure, they would
in the
come
meetings
socially and
the social events and the meetings. So we had a larger number, I guess, of lawyers were members of the Bar Association in Dauphin County than we might have had for the size of the county and the number of lawyers.
Well, you remember, too, in those days, the state attorneys worked part-time for the state.
Right.
They practiced regularly in the Dauphin County Bar, but then they would work part-time for the state. In addition to that, we had many functions that the other counties didn't have, because we were the Commonwealth Court at that time, the bench. And so every county attorney was allowed to practice in Dauphin County, unlike the rules that existed in every other county that said you had to be within that county to practice. Any other attorney from 66 different counties could practice in Dauphin County. They didn't all become members because there was some rules having to do with either you had to have your office or your residency or both within the county. And it became difficult because of Camp Hill and the Lemoyne area where a lot of attorneys lived.
Well, it was another world at
Oh,
that
God,
time.
yeah, that river.
There wasn't the social interaction between Cumberland County lawyers and Dauphin County lawyers.
Except for the few that were members of
Well,
ours.
Charlie
The few-
Stone, I
Yeah,
think.
Charlie
The
had
few
that.
who straddled the river. I was one of those. I seem to have been a straddler.
Yeah.
And Bill Schuessler and Ralph Sheets and Gene Reeder.
That Gene
He was
was.
one of those. But of course, this brings to mind, of course, when I was on the Hill, as we used to call it, and the Justice Department had a matter involving another county, and we had to go to Cambria County, for example, because there was something out there that the state's involved with. And, well, we could go there, but we had to have local counsel.
Yep.
Now, how do you get local counsel? If you're in the Attorney General's office in 1957 and you need a lawyer in Cambria County, you look at the list of lawyers acceptable. And who supplied the list? The county chairman of Cambria County.
But what
Who
county
was-
chairman of what?
The county chairman of the Democratic Party, because the Democrats were in charge.
In Cambria
That's
County.
when it was the leader time, and George Leader was a Democrat, Herb Cohen was a Democratic list from the Democratic county chairman, and it was a short list. And so you could have one of those lawyers if you had to call a lawyer, but you couldn't have anybody else because that's not the way it was done.
And
Now-
you had to pay that lawyer.
That lawyer got paid, he billed the Commonwealth for whatever he did. Again, they were almost always men. Did that particular lawyer have any idea or expertise in the particular problem you had? Well, that was totally irrelevant, of course. This was all about politics.
Okay.
That's the way things were done in those days.
So when you would have your bar association meetings and you would then go retire to the lawyers' lounge, did that become a little bit more of a social
Oh, yeah.
occasion?
Yeah, we had socials.
And
we,
were the women allowed to be there?
to be honest with you, they were invited to the meetings, but very few of our women showed up. At that particular time, if I remember correctly, we had about 8 women that were members of the Dauphin County Bar. Only 3 of them were practicing attorneys from the standpoint of being in court. The other 5 were attorneys that were on the master's list. And the only time that they would appear in any litigation would be when they were appointed a master for the $75.
For divorce?
Well, but
Correct.
at the same time, in Dauphin County, every year we had a bar association party, black tie, at the Hershey Hotel, and the women were
That was
not.
our banquet.
The women were not invited to that.
Correct.
That was stag. And black tie, all these lawyers would put on their black ties with the judges and have dinner and have a very sociable evening.
We also had a picnic that
Yeah.
they weren't invited, but there was a routine.
Tell me about the routine.
The routine was rather unusual. Generally, whoever at that time was the secretary of the Bar Association was responsible for buying a box of candy and delivering it to the 3 attorneys that were active in the Bar
The
Association.
3 women.
3 women attorneys. And they knew what it was for, and they thanked us. The bar picnic was usually, in addition to the candy for the women attorneys, we also purchased peanuts, shelled peanuts from the peanut shop. And we also went down to Santander and purchased bananas. Now, I have absolutely no idea where that habit came from, but at the bar picnic, in addition to passing out cigars, they would handle all the bananas and all the peanuts that you can eat, in addition to the food that we had.
And where would you hold the picnics?
Well, it varied. As long as I could remember, before we went to a gentleman by the name of Schaefer, who was one of our attorneys, he had a huge area, and he was besides being an attorney, he also owned a commercial venture. And they built a huge facility for picnics. And when we
Schaefer's Farm was where they used to have some
correct,
picnics.
and it was a pavilion built out of steel, and it had water and dressing rooms. It also had a what they call a mud swimming pool. He took a bulldozer and literally dug it deep enough and put a wall around it, but didn't put any cement on the bottom, and initially. And so he had dressing rooms, and they had a kitchen, and they had everything, but the pavilion was wide open under a roof.
That was Maurice Schaefer.
Correct.
He had a
Maurice Schaefer,
trucking
yeah,
business.
yeah.
And who had a farm out on the Pinetown Road in Newberry Township
That's correct.
in York County.
Yep,
So you went to York County for the Dauphin County picnic.
but that was later.
Before that, you went to the postal grounds.
You went everywhere.
I can't remember where the postal grounds were, but I went
They're
there,
up
I
in
know.
Fishing Creek Valley.
Okay.
Yep. We went there, but we also would go to a shooting range, which is a sportsman's club. It used to be behind Latchaw's lumberyard,
Off Linglestown Road.
right? And we went there. And majority of the picnics, believe it or not, were held at the Hershey Country Club initially, and that at that time happened to be the home of Hershey. He had a country club which started
That's
the
right.
golf course right there. But
Milton
it-
Hershey was still alive back then?
No. He was, if he was, I didn't know it. But I mean, he was gone from the house, and the house was into a country club because the back end of the house had a huge patio where we used to eat our barbecue and dinners and things like that for the picnic.
That was the Milton Hershey's home.
Yeah,
Became the Hershey Country Club.
that's correct.
And while he was still alive, he lived in a small apartment on the second floor in that building. Very few people know that, but he did. And it was Hershey Country Club, the rest of it. And when he passed away, of course, they converted the whole thing, and it was the Hershey Country Club. We went there.
That's correct. And we went there for the majority of the times. And then after that,
We went to Allenbury.
we went to Allenbury, but that started later.
Yeah.
We went with Charlie Hines. But before that, we would go to the different country clubs. We would go to Blue Ridge, we went to Harrisburg, we went several times to the West Shore. The problem was that a lot of the country clubs wouldn't close their facilities, so it was difficult mingling and getting tea times and everything from that standpoint. So it became very difficult and expensive to go to the country clubs. So we made a deal with Charlie Hines, and he owned the Allenbury, and they used to do it for us.
Well, the sociability of lawyers in those several decades ago was, I think, a time when lawyers didn't specialize like they do today. So do you feel like back then more lawyers interacted with more lawyers versus today where it's pretty narrow field of you're either in real estate, you're in litigation, you're in family law?
I recently found in my effects, I have too many things, but I found a list of the lawyers in Cumberland County in 1960. It was about 55 lawyers, and I realized I knew them all of them in some way, in some small matter or large, mostly small. I knew all these people. And I also, a couple years ago, a junk man friend of ours, professional junk man, found in somebody's trash bin the 1940 Dauphin County Bar picture, which I think you have hanging down here on the hallway somewhere. But I now have that in my cellar. And Elizabeth and I looked at that, and there were only 100 and some lawyers on that picture. And Elizabeth and I, my wife Elizabeth and I, realized that we knew something about almost all those lawyers, because they were all Harrisburg people, and we sort of knew about them, or we knew their families, and we knew their children or something. We could connect with almost everybody in that picture. Now, if you look at the Dauphin County Bar Facebook now, I won't know more than 2%.
Do you recall having some interaction, social or professional, with almost every lawyer back then?
Absolutely. I think what's happening today is something that's evolving across all of people. The institutions are no longer revered. I mean, we were proud to be members of the Dauphin County Bar Association and to be members of the Dauphin County
And you
Bar.
showed up. You showed
Everybody
up.
showed
And now
up.
what I'm learning is, as Roy points out, people are not showing up. And I've just hearing from the Cumberland County Bar Association that the membership is actually declining. Even though there are more lawyers around than ever, they don't join the Bar Association.
But didn't
There's
you
a reason-
love being with other lawyers and
Oh.
having that social time together?
Well, and if you
Yeah.
didn't show up, Charlie, everybody knew everybody, just like you said, and Len said, the number of lawyers, we knew each other, we
And we
interacted with each
Sure.
other because we were engaged practicing law.
And again, as somebody else has pointed out, now people are specializing. They have this little niche. That's all they do. And so they only meet lawyers who do that same thing. They don't meet the other lawyers and never need to. And that's, I think, regrettable.
The biggest problem, and it's also in the Pennsylvania Bar as well as the Philadelphia Bar Association, they're losing memberships because years ago, the firms, the large firms, as well as the small firms, always paid the dues of the membership of the counties. It's not so anymore. Or if they're a partnership, it doesn't make any difference. It still comes out of the individual. So as a result, a lot of the attorneys, the younger attorneys that are really the core of your active bar association, are finding that they are required to bill so many hours per year that they don't have the time to take off an afternoon or a day or whatever it happens to be for different functions. And so it's after hours if they're going to do it. And most of them don't live in the city anymore, and so they have to commute, or they don't have parking, or whatever the situation is, and the bar associations are suffering from that point. Membership, however, has declined from the standpoint of where we were at one time, but this bar went from, when I could remember, from 1959 to 260 to about 1,700. And the reason being is, thanks to Roy, when he was the Attorney General, he was able to get the finances to pay for all of his members of the bar to our bar association. It continued for a few years, but little by little that dwindled out. Now, all the bar associations make special arrangements for government attorneys, for corporate attorneys, and so as a result, you have limited type of memberships with the Bar Association. And so we're a few counties that still are what they call 100% membership.
Well,
But
let's talk- go ahead.
management, Charlie said it, I guess, management encouraged lawyers to be a part of the Bar Association. They wanted you to be a part of that. If your bosses said, "Are you going to the bar meeting tonight?" "Yes, sir." And that's what you started doing. But I think that today in society, too, gentlemen, I think that institutions are all suffering, whether it's country clubs or bar associations or whatever. And you do see, if you talk to a lawyer, I have some fun with it at the firm. I say, "Hey, are you going to the Bar Association meeting tonight?" And they look at you like, "What?" What?
Exactly. Yes.
Well, when I was a young lawyer, I paid my own bar association dues because I loved meeting and being with other lawyers. I looked forward to being with other lawyers, and it was a good time for referrals.
Yeah.
If I had a criminal matter or
Absolutely.
a matter that I did
Sure.
not handle, or I got referrals. So I found it not just socially pleasing, but also professionally rewarding both ways. And I think that probably was your experience as well. But one thing Len Tintner brought up was the required billable hours, which is demanding on many lawyers today. Do you recall how we evolved into billable hours at the law firms, and then how we evolved to billing per hour versus for the job?
Well, my recollection just started off. My recollection is when I started in the 60s to practice law, nobody billed by the hour that I interacted with. I mean, maybe some of the larger firms did back then, but it was not the thing. You met with a client came to see you, you had a matter, whether it was a divorce or a property dispute, whatever, you got a retainer of a couple $100, and you said this will cover you until we reach another point. But then, remember, there were no cell phones, there were no computers. You would talk to your client that day, and you may not hear from your client for a week. But you wrote a letter to your client, and you confirmed your understanding in writing. But today, with all of this interaction with computers and so forth, clients want the answer in the afternoon of the morning that you were retained. Few years, and so I learned a little bit about the economics of big firms, and it's tedious. You have to work, and there, you can't say that you don't know, because people who are interviewed in larger firms today, now that's my experience, they don't get the encouragement, first of all, to participate in institutions. The firm says, I want you to bill hours rather than go to the Bar Association. And you better bill hours, or you're going to be in trouble. So it's a whole different philosophy.
In those days, those days 50 years ago, 40 years ago, much of what we did was flat rate. Like the garage knows it's going to be $200 to change your wheels or something. The minimum fee schedule was a factor. If you wrote a deed, you were supposed to get $25, and so you got $25. And if you did a divorce, the uncontested divorce, you might get $300 or something. You knew that's what it was. So the hours didn't really factor in. And with estates, you got the blessed 5%. You were tried to. With real estate deals, you pretty much had a rate, a schedule, what you were going to charge to settle a house or close the mortgage. So the hourly rate didn't come into my life much at all. Now, I got into representing some developers and builders who got into complicated situations, fighting with the township about getting the plan approved and going to all the meetings and waiting for the motion to table the plan until the next meeting and all that. And how did you bill for that? Well, I started to keep track of hours, but then I didn't quite know. I was always very awkward and uncomfortable about this. I didn't quite know what to do. I probably undercharged a lot.
Well, Len,
our firm still doesn't have minimum requirements with hours, but we do bill by the hour. And the only reason why is because there's no longer a minimum fee bill. And as a result, you have to have some measure of indication to the client. And so when you have a letter of representation executed, which is now required by your insurance companies, you have to put in there an hourly rate, or you have to put in a percentage if you do contingent fee type of work. Otherwise, you're violating the rules of professional ethics according to everybody now, and consequently, they require you to have a client should know what it's going to cost. And it's not, and I still believe personally that if I'm going to do a deed, I know how much it's going to cost, and I can tell my client. But at the same time, if I'm handling a transaction where you have no idea how long it's going to take or whether it's going to be an adverse procedure, you got to put something down, or otherwise your client's going to jump at the end of the client or at the end of the case when he gets a bill. And so you have to have this in advance.
Well, that does still happen, I think. So
It does.
How did we go from having this standard fee that everybody knew, all the lawyers knew what they were to charge locally?
The insurance industry started this, and we did, the small firm I was with, we did defense work for insurance companies as well. And they started to question the fees that lawyers were charging them, and said, well, how much time do you spend on my matter? And that was the beginning of the discussion, and it started in the insurance industry, and that was the evolution of the hourly rate, because then the insurance company felt that they were only paying for what was being done on their file, and they could track it. They knew exactly how much it was going to be.
And that's how the hourly fee system started. And
yes.
Was that in the 60s?
Yeah, I guess 60s, yeah.
The case came
60s.
about, it was a Virginia case.
Yeah.
It was a Virginia case that was brought before the Supreme Court on an antitrust.
Yes.
And they brought the bar associations in. And at the time, everybody had minimum fees, and they felt that that's illegal. It violated whatever the antitrust law was at that particular time.
Price fixing?
I want to say that was a Goldberg case. Do I have that name right?
I don't know what the name was,
I
but
think it might have been.
came against, it was a Supreme Court against the state of Virginia,
Right.
was the case. Now, what it involved, I don't know. Somebody had to be the instigator to that particular case, but he killed all the bar associations who had minimum fees. And to be honest with you, the smaller municipalities pay no attention. I mean, you go to a small county, right after they pass that law, or 10 years after they pass the law, and you'll still get billed preparation of this or document this, and you still get a bill. And it's not based on hourly rates, but that's beside the point. From the standpoint of the firms that were required and that entered into these letters of retention, you put it down.
But the new thing now in big firms across the board,
Yep.
what goes around comes around. Now, the discussion is, well, we don't want any of this billable hour stuff anymore. We want to know what you're charging us, what's the flat fee, or alternative fee arrangements. A variety of different alternative fee arrangements. So what goes around comes around.
So let's talk about practicing law. Today, I think we all know, we all have our cell phones with us. We carry our computers with us 24/7. We get texts 24/7 from other lawyers, from clients. Judges get them from lawyers and court administrators 24/7. But do you remember, and tell us about, it used to be you wrote a letter and it took 3 days to get there, and then the lawyer who got the letter took a day or two to think about it, and then maybe wrote a letter back the following week, and you'd get the letter back in another 3 days. Courts made decisions a little slower maybe in those days too, I don't know, but practicing law in the 60s, was it pretty much like that? You didn't hear back for 3 or 4 days?
What changed the world was not the phone or the texting, the fax machine, which came around maybe as recently as the mid-'80s, maybe 30 years ago. We first had fax machines. And then everybody got a fax machine, and then you would get the fax, and then 2 minutes later the phone would ring. What do you think, Charlie? What do we do? So there was no more writing the letter and answering the letter. Instant response was required. And then, of course, we moved from the fax machine to the phone to all the stuff that we have now. Yes.
But see, before, there was more of a conversation understanding. When I talked to an attorney, if I would call Roy up and say, Roy, could you give me an extra week in answering this? He'd say yes. I didn't say send me a letter. I didn't say fax it to me. Of course, we didn't have it. And that was all there was to it. What happened, the attorneys developed by numbers. And so when you had 267, the chances are of the practicing attorneys that everybody knew, maybe 200, maybe 150, and you knew them personally. Now, when you have 1,000 attorneys, you get to still know 200 attorneys. And so somebody calls you up and says, hey, can I have extra time? Who are you? We don't know them. We don't have any idea of their reputation. And unfortunately, I'm sure every one of us, over years before we had these requirements of written documentation, we got stung sometimes.
But you also knew personally which lawyer's
Correct.
agreement was their bond. and
Absolutely.
which
I
were
was not around very long before I got the sense of who was not quite 100% reliable. Everybody sort of knew who they were. I will never mention the names here, but there were some, and everybody seemed to know that.
Well, that was
said that.
when you were admitted to the bar and you had your preceptor days. It was a confidential, informal discussion about who you could rely on and who you couldn't at the bar. And I'm not going to mention any names, but there were not many. If you talk to this person, you better make sure you get something in writing.
Exactly.
Correct.
But everybody else...
We learned all that right away.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I would call
game.
Charlie or Charlie called me or Len, we know you need 10 days, yeah, go ahead. And that's it.
We used to have an attorney, his son still practices, I think, Robert Knupp. Bob Knupp, the older gentleman, was the ethics. And once you were admitted, you received from the president or secretary of the Dauphin County Bar Association a book containing the rules of court and the minimum fee bill. And you received from Mr. Knupp a book that was written by Drinker. I'll never forget the name because it was always a joke. We're getting an ethics book by Drinker. But anyway, it was a book by Mr. Drinker, who was,
Biddle firm, I'll bet.
Probably.
Yes.
which was based on how to treat other attorneys.
Right.
And I'd say once every 2 or 3 meetings, Bob would get up and give a report. And he would go into the details, and he felt that the biggest problem the Bar Association was having at that time, and I'm talking about the early 60s, attorneys were failing to return the attorney's phone calls promptly. And he used to tell a story, to this day I'll never forget it. He used to tell a story that when his secretary would buzz him and he was on the phone, it would come through the machine, Charlie Stone is on the other phone. And he would deliberately, he said he would do it all the time, regardless of who he was on the phone. He'd press the button, put that person on hold, and say, Charlie, I'll be with you in a minute. And he'd press the button and go back to talking.
Yep.
And that's the way he would do it. And he says, never would go home that day without returning the phone call.
But you know, fellas, as all of this evolved, and we complained when we were limited to practicing in Dauphin County. And when you couldn't, multi-county practice was not permitted. And people like Judge Schugert were the enforcer of that.
Seriously enforcement.
Seriously, yeah.
Oh, my.
We all experienced that. But as that disappeared, and you didn't know the lawyers that you were talking to or you may have matters with. And that changed the
Judge
whole...
Schugert wanted to know all the lawyers who came before him, and he was not happy if he did not know them.
Right.
But it brings to mind another Judge Schugert quirk. If you wanted an order signed, your motion granted, whatever it was, and
Fire engine.
he did what you wanted him to do or didn't do it, nobody called you and nobody mailed it to you. They put it in your file in the Prothonotary's office.
A number you got
And
as
you
an
had
attorney.
the Charles Stone file that was in the Prothonotary's office in Carlisle, and if I wanted to find out what Judge Schugert had done with my problem, I had to go there and look at it myself or send somebody to the courthouse to look.
What?
Nobody would call you.
I got a membership card when they were allowed inter-county practice. I applied for membership, and I got a red card from the Prothonotary of Cumberland County, and I had a number on it. Let's say it was 165. And whenever I would file a pleading, if I would file a complaint, and if within 20 days I didn't get an answer, and this was before the 10-day notice, 20 days I wouldn't get an answer, if I took a snap judgment and went over there to try it or ask for something, the judge would ask me, did you check your box? What box? In the Prothonotary's office, 165 had a file. And if I go there, their rules of court said you can file your answer by putting it in that attorney's box.
Right.
So you didn't file it in the Prothonotary office?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
where it was.
it was filed.
You clocked it in and put a copy
But nobody
instead of
told you.
sending it to you.
Nobody told you.
Nobody
Nobody
told you.
They
tells
put
you.
it in your file.
He was taken by a Philadelphia firm to the Supreme Court, and he was ordered, by court order, which he had to post. I'll never forget that. He posted it in his own Prothonotary under several papers, but he posted it and said that will no longer be necessary.
So did we do that in Dauphin County?
No, We were the Commonwealth Court.
we were the
so
Commonwealth Court,
We were so
so-
used to doing notices that it never happened.
But I think Charlie and Len, you've experienced particular judges, even within Dauphin County, had their own rules.
Oh, gosh.
So give us
of
some
course.
examples.
Well, one example
course.
I remember when I was in the courtroom, Judge Kreider had a rule in his courtroom about points per charge. And you had to have 2 inches of space between the points per charge.
For your proposed jury instruction.
Proposed jury
Okay.
instructions, because he wanted to, and he explained this to me, I was in violation, and he called me in. He said, Mr. Zimmerman, your points per charge aren't properly filed. And he was right, because he did have a rule, because he liked to interline in that space whatever his comments were or cases that he was going to cite. So different judges did have some,
Of course,
Well, and that was
Unique
before
rules.
the standard jury
right,
instructions.
right.
That's when
Oh,
the
yes.
lawyers and judges came up with their own version based on their
Right.
particular point
Yep.
of view. How was your relationship with the judges back in the 60s, 70s, 80s? Would you say it's better than it is today or different?
It was more formal. Very rarely, except on the bar picnic or the bar meetings, if there were always a few judges that would come regularly to the bar meetings. And because they were, previous to that, they were active in the Bar Association, and they continued that. There were many members of the bar, or the bench, that felt that once they became elevated, that they had to stay, you had to be a bit removed from the sociability, except on certain occasions, and that would be at a bar banquet or the bar picnic, or at the meetings for the ones that showed. Now, we always had, at the bar banquet, believe it or not, always the judges would show up. And it became a little rowdy, and I use that loosely, because they used to get rather an hour open bar at a cocktail party at Hershey Country Club was too much. And by the time the men sat down to eat, I can assure you that those that took advantage of that particular hour were somewhat happy of the occasion.
Relaxed.
Very much so, to the extent that if we used to have entertainment at the bar banquets, and the banquets the young lawyers at that time, the junior bar, would put on a skit. And there were several members of the bar, of the social committee, that would like to make fun of the bench. So the skit was always of unnamed bench members, but their actions spoke as to whom they might be, to the extent that we had some wild skits.
So they knew the personalities and quirks of the
Absolutely,
judges.
and we did not just limit it to the one or two. We made sure that all of the members of the bench were equally treated. Unfortunately, some of them had some rather
Unique quirks.
well, that, and also were very sensitive as to what was being said by other people. And as a result, there were some rather inquiries made to members of the Bar Association as to who drafted these particular skits. So after a while, we decided, or the court kind of recommended, that we eliminate the skits.
Do you remember some of the skits, Roy?
Vaguely.
They were copied, and they were in the drawer of a particular attorney who, upon his passing, I understood were supposed to be turned over to the Bar Association, but we have never been able to find them.
But you know, one of the things at that I remember the Hershey, the Hotel
Yeah.
Hershey stay. I was a low guy on the totem pole, and I don't know who called me anymore. It wasn't in my firm, but some lawyer called me of the Bar Association and other young lawyers. I was designated to drive a judge,
Oh, yeah.
and I could not drink. So I would pick, and I remember you talking about Wickersham, Brewster Wickersham lived on Front Street.
Right.
And I remember I had different judges a couple times, and I would pick them up, I would pick him up, I picked up Stone one time at his house and
Front
drove
Street.
him up to Brewster Wickersham's, and I wasn't invited to go up, so he went up and I was the chauffeur. I waited until he came back down, and then he got in the car, and I drove him to Hershey, and he had a good time, and I was there and watching all of this, and then he wanted to go to Martini's Bar in Hershey. It was a place called Martini's. We all went to. And so he said, I want to go there. I said, okay, Judge. We went to Martini's, and we closed that place about midnight, and then I drove him home. But that was expected during a period of time, right, Len?
That's correct. In fact, there were...
So that
to
they
this-
could drink, and they didn't have to worry about driving.
Were you allowed to drink and just not overdrink?
No,
as a
he was a
driver?
designated
I
driver.
was-
We had several of those.
Yeah.
We did. We had members that didn't drink and were kind enough to, because we had many attorneys that left their cars there because they wouldn't drive back. They were not
Oh.
capable at that particular time. But I
So
will
heard
tell
there
you,
were rolls thrown at one of these.
Yes.
yes, I'll tell you about that. The Cumberland County judge at that particular time had a habit, not a habit, he had a rule that if any attorney ever appeared before him on a drunken driving charge, that they went to jail for a day. And so we
What
just,
judge was that?
at that time it was Judge Sugar.
Judge Sugar.
We had we decided that at that particular time, we always invited the judges free. And for whatever reason whatsoever, I don't know why, but they came to me and said, see if you could get the West Shore Country Club, because we have decided we're going to invite Judge Sugar and Judge Widener to our banquet, because if we ever get intoxicated, we don't want them because of the drive across the bridge. And I thought it was a joke, but they meant it. So I went ahead, the president told me to do it, so I went ahead and I booked the country club and I invited the judges. Well, the judges got there, and they were there in addition to our judges that showed, and they were up at the podium together with the president. And by that time, we also had the hour cocktail party, so the typical attorneys were somewhat under the weather or very happy. And I don't know what happened, but somebody decided that the president at that time, that they should call on the president judge of Cumberland County, since we were visiting his county, and he got up. And as he did very soberly, he decided to discuss some things that just did not entertain the membership, to the extent that we had these tea rolls or dinner rolls that all of a sudden they started throwing. And
No one in this room would have been a part of that.
no. And one of them happened to hit the head of the judge. Now, it didn't hurt him, and he became so upset that he said in the microphone, "This is the last time I will ever appear before the Dauphin County Bar Association." And as he did, he walked right out, and that was the end we saw him.
But it's a
But he had a
memorable
rule.
story.
Yeah, oh, it's a memorable story, yes.
That's it.
But he had a rule, not just for lawyers.
Oh, no, he
If
put
you've
the
got-
wife, he put a wife
He
in.
put wives, businessmen.
Everybody.
You had to sit in the you had to
In
sit
jail
in jail
for a day.
A day. In Cumberland County, mandatory one day.
Including a member of the Dauphin County Bar, and I probably should not mention the name right now. Yes, it happened to a very prominent
I knew a
family.
wife. I knew a wife of one of
I'd
our
heard
attorneys.
wives.
Yeah, I didn't know the
Yeah.
attorney.
But he had- that was his
doesn't
rule.
surprise me. We had a ethics committee, and it was made up of Arthur Goldberg, and I can't think of the other one.
Wilhelm E. Schisler?
No,
No?
this is after Wilhelm.
After
no.
Wilhelm, okay.
No, he wasn't around at that time. It was Arthur Goldberg. There was another, bless you. and there was myself as the secretary of the bar. And unfortunately, we had several members of our bar who, upon appearing before the courts, would be very zealous in defending their clients. Or, if it happened to be a criminal case, the prosecutors were very deliberate in their argument, to the extent that some judges would kindly just say, "Pardon me, but I've heard enough." Some of the attorneys felt that they were being paid for a job and they're going to finish their job. And so as a result, a couple of the judges put these attorneys in contempt and had the sheriff take them to jail. And they were locked up in our basement, which is where we have the holding cell at the time. And they were put down there. And at that particular time, I'd get a phone call from somebody, whether it was the secretary of the judge or whatever, or the district attorney. And I was told to get a hold of Arthur Goldberg and make arrangements to meet. And at 4 o'clock, we would go up after court and meet with the judge. And of course, the attorneys were released with their promise not to do it again, and an apology to the court. And of course, it wasn't made in open court, which was satisfactory to the judge at the time. We had several, or at least 2, I think, district attorneys, assistant district attorneys, that were, by their boss, was told that they are not to appear before that court anymore, that judge. We had
Just
one
certain judges that did this?
judge in particular.
And who was that?
Well, it was Judge Shelley.
Judge Shelley was the
He
big,
was particular, very much so. He put in, and one of them ended up being a judge that was in jail, I mean in the court for contempt.
Judge Kleinfeller.
Yep.
Well, I think he got put in the
He-
slammer in York.
And
Yeah, I heard that.
the other name I know, if I may mention it, Jack Hall.
Jack Hall was the one that was forbidden to come into Judge
Right.
Shelley's courtroom. Also, we had Joe Klein,
Joe Kleinfelder, after that.
not Joe
No, Joe
Kleinfelder,
Klein.
Joe Klein himself.
Well, Joe,
Oh, yeah, remember that? I didn't know that part.
I was involved with the Joe Klein
Okay.
story. So
Yeah.
I was the DA.
Joe
and-
Kleinfelder actually was
And,
put
and
out
Judge
by
Shelley
that- yeah.
did not want him in his courtroom, and he had a reason. Joe was not a morning person, and he would always be late coming into the office. And in criminal court, Judge Shelley would always, when he would come out on the bench, he would not announce. He would just, at the appointed hour, he would walk out and expect everything to happen. Well, criminal court was a busy place. And so we had a jury trial, and I don't know really how Joe Klein got assigned to it, but somebody assigned him to go into Shelley's courtroom for this jury trial. And so the jury's in the box, sitting. The courtroom's packed with people. Shelley comes in, and they can't, where's the prosecutor? So he calls me, and I go up, and he says, "You see, why did you send him into my courtroom? You get me all exercise, blah, blah," and he's giving me khaki. So I said, "Well, I'm sorry, Judge. I didn't think that would happen, but I apologize for that." So in the meantime, he says, "I want him up here." So he calls, we get Klein, I go down and see Joe, and he said, I'm going to hold him in contempt and blah, blah, blah. And so we're talking about that in the chambers. And he did, then he announced he was going to hold him in contempt. He
Yeah.
did. So I went to see the judge, and I said, "Judge, I'll file a petition to purge the complaint." And I said, "Mr. Klein will apologize to you in open court." Now, the jury's sitting in the box. The courtroom is filled with people.
That I
Okay.
didn't know, but
So I take Joe Klein up, and I said, "Joe, you're just going to apologize. I'll call it, and just apologize, and it'll be over." So we go up, we're standing at the bar. And I said, "May it please the court, please consider this a petition to purge the complaint that the court has imposed on Mr. Klein. He apologizes and so forth." And then Judge Shelley said, "Well, I want to hear him." And so Joe said, "Your Honor, I apologize," like that. That was it.
That would be Joe.
That was it. So Shelley the judge starts to talk, and he says, the time, he had this down to a mathematical science. He could tell you how much it costs the county, that they pay each jury so much, and the jury is sitting here so long, and this is what it costs the county when you're late, Mr. Klein, and you are late a lot, and then so forth. So,
Is the jury there hearing?
yes, the jury, yeah. So, I'm poking Joe because I could tell, and then finally, Shelley was trying to add some levity to this at the end, because it was all over. He was accepting the apology, all right? And he said, he says, Mr. Klein, this could cause me to have a heart attack when I come out here and nobody's here. Well, Joe can't let it alone.
No, Joe was,
In a stage whisper, he leans over to me and said, hell, he doesn't even have a heart. Well, Shelley says, that's it. Contempt, you're in contempt of court. And he stormed off and we recessed. And so I had to work at that again. But that was a funny experience. It wasn't funny to Joe.
No.
And it wasn't funny to all the people in the courtroom. But that's a true story. I can attest to that one.
Now, isn't it true that after Joe Kleinfelder had a similar experience, he left Dauphin County and went to York County for a while?
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Yes,
did.
that did happen. So it was pretty
Oh,
tough
boy.
on
Well,
Joe.
you know what, maybe we can get together another day for some more stories, but I really appreciate the time you've spent with us today.
How long
and,
have we been at this?
Pardon me?
How long have
2.5
we been at
hours.
this now? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
All right.
So thank you very much.
Judge, you're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you.
Happy to do it
Thank
for
you.
you. Good.
Good holiday.